Alright, so here's everything that you need to know about apartheid. Now, although apartheid officially began in 1948, South Africa's history of racial domination and oppression began in the mid-1700s, when the Dutch settlers began to colonize South Africa, forcing the occupants out of their lands or using them as laborers. Eventually, in the 18th and 19th centuries, a whole bunch of other European nations like the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Belgians, and the Germans, they all came and colonized and took control of almost all of the 50 states of the African nation. But by the end of the 19th century, it was mainly the British that controlled most of East, Northeast, West, Central, and South Africa, while the French mainly controlled Northern Africa. At this time, South Africa was divided into 4 territories, 2 of which were ruled by the British and 2 of which were ruled by the Dutch descendants, also known as the Boers or the Afrikaners. The black people, the Africans, did not have any political rights in these 4 territories, and racial segregation at this point was already very prominent in South Africa. Eventually, in 1910, the British Parliament passed the Act of Union, which brought the British and Afrikaner colonies together under the same government. But unfortunately, the new South African government was just as racially divided as the old one. All parliamentary rights were removed for black people, and a large segment of the Asian and colored populations was forced to relocate out of so-called white areas. Many African townships were also demolished, and their occupants were sent to live in reserves. These were all events in the South African government's plan to increase its power and to ensure that whites would remain in power. Now, even after the Act of Union was established, there was still a lot of tension and an uneasy power sharing between the Dutch and the English, and this continued until the 1940s. When the Afrikaner National Party came into power. The National Party invented apartheid, a term that literally means separateness or apart in Dutch, to help them cement their control over the economic and social system in South Africa. But that wasn't their only goal. At the same time, the party enacted a series of bills to ensure that the whites maintained their dominance over all the other racial groups, and essentially make the divide between the whites and the colored people even bigger. Now, the era of apartheid lasted from 1948 to 1994. During these years, the policy of apartheid was embedded into South Africa's legal system in the form of a series of laws that further extended racial separation. For example, in 1949, the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act was introduced, which, as the name clearly states, prohibited marriage between the white and the non-white people. In 1950, the amendment of the Immortality Act was introduced. This law made it a criminal offense for a white person to have any relations with a person of a different race. In the same year, the Population Registration Act was introduced. This law forced all South Africans to register as black, white, Asian, or colored. In the same year, the Suppression of Communism Act was also introduced. This law banned any opposition party the government considered as communist, like the African National Congress, the ANC. But this group, led by Nelson Mandela, responded with a protest of civil disobedience after hearing this, that eventually caused a clash between the government and the black protesters, which resulted in the death of 70 people and injuring more than 100. A couple years later, Nelson Mandela was sent to prison. In 1950 also, the Group Areas Act was introduced. This law barred people of particular races from various urban areas that were populated by white people. It's quite similar to the Reservation of Separation Amenities Act that was introduced in 1953, which prohibited people of different races from using the same public amenities as white people. The Bantu Education Act was also introduced in 1953. This law was designed to reduce the level of education that could be attainable by black people. In 1956, the Mines and Work Act was introduced. This law formalized racial discrimination in employment. And lastly, in 1971, the Black Homeland Citizenship Act was introduced. This law changed the status of the inhabitants of the homelands so that they were no longer citizens of South Africa. In the 1980s, it was apparent that apartheid was coming to an end. South Africa had 2 million unemployed blacks, while white minority and diligent black resistance, which was primarily led by Nelson Mandela. To make matters worse, the economy was also declining severely. It was clear that something had to change. After 28 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was released. He worked to make South Africa welcoming to different ethnicities again. In 1994, he won this fight and the first multicultural elections were held. His party, the ANC, won and Nelson Mandela was elected president. Apartheid in 1994 was now over.